Sirens slice the night. Woman, life, freedom shakes the street. A van door slams. One life vanishes into custody, and a nation ignites. Here's what most headlines miss. That door is just the last click of an apparatus thousands of years in the making, built long before morality police, before 1979, before Islam itself. To see how Iran arrived here, we zoom out, past revolutions and shahs, past conquests, into a world where law wasn't merely enforced, it was sacred. Across centuries, Iranian states fused faith, justice, and kingship into a single public ethic. Virtue wasn't only preached, it was built into routines, through courts, councils, clerics, constitutions, until many believed a society's inner life belonged to public stewardship. Spot that pattern, and today starts to look less like a rupture and more like part of a very long story. We'll trace that pattern. The Quran's unusual authority, Shi'i succession debates that empowered jurists, the Safavid invention of a Shi'i state, westoxication and cultural backlash, and how Khomeini's guardianship of the jurist turned clerical ethics into constitutional command. And at the end, I'll reveal a hidden moral map, older than Islam, one that quietly wired the whole system. This is Armchair Archaeology, where we excavate ruins you can't see, rituals, ideologies, cosmologies. We don't just retell history, we follow the thread that ties ancient worldviews to modern headlines. So today finally makes sense. Stay to the end for a connection you can feel without naming, an older logic of legitimacy, once visible on crowns and cliff faces, reappearing in paperwork and oaths. One idea carried for millennia, shaping a theocracy before the word even existed.
Let's go back to the very beginning, where the idea of moral order becomes public law. Imagine the ancient Near East as a web of caravan roads and temple cities, smoke from altars, tablets drying in the sun, a shepherd who hears a promise. Abraham's story is framed as a covenant. Commit to a path of right conduct, and a people will be shaped by it. Not a loose vow, but a bond with terms, the kind that orders daily life as much as it guides the soul. Righteousness isn't only private virtue, it becomes the basis for a community's rules. Across the Euphrates, a black basalt stele shows King Hammurabi before the sun god Shamash, receiving a rod and ring, tools of measurement. Justice, the scene insists, is not whim, it's something you can measure. The code etched below covers wages and contracts, marriage and malpractice, the ordinary given public standards. Law steps onto the stage not as palace convenience, but as a calibrated reflection of the cosmos. When a builder's house collapses, liability isn't just practical, it's moral arithmetic set against a scale that claims heavenly approval. You can hear its echo today in building codes and consumer protections that still try to weigh fairness with instruments the public can see. The Abrahamic tradition moves within the same architecture: one God, a people bound by revealed instruction, and a conviction that faithfulness must take social form. Later disagreements, who bears final authority, which practices are decisive, unfold inside that scaffolding. Expectation hardens. A community should live by sacred norms, and rulers are judged by how they guard those norms. Read the prologue of Hammurabi's stele, the one in the Louvre, and the intention is unmistakable. Establish justice in the land, restrain the strong, protect the weak. The earliest surviving code treats law as moral defense, public and visible. Once morality can be carved into stone, it can be administered from benches and gates. From covenant to code to courtroom, a clear pattern appears. Morality becomes something a community builds together, not just something individuals feel. If patterns like this reshape how you read the past, you'll feel at home here. Consider subscribing so you don't miss the next thread we pull from the ruins.
Jump forward more than 1,000 years. In Islam, scripture is not mainly a story about God, it is God speaking. That distinction changes everything. The Qur'an is approached as direct, unedited address, recited aloud, memorized by millions, carried as sound before it is carried as ink. A translation can be beautiful or useful, but it is never the Qur'an itself, only an interpretation of the Arabic. So authority doesn't just live in the meaning, it lives in the exact words, their rhythm, the breath that carries them. Law drawn from such speech doesn't feel like ordinary policy, it feels like obedience. This frame refocuses the human problem. There is no doctrine of original sin smudging every life at the start. Children are born in fitra, a native orientation toward what is right. Error comes later, through choices. Purification is not a rare ceremony for the fallen, it is a daily craft. Prayer, fasting, almsgiving, truthful dealing, modesty in public space. Virtue is expected to be visible and shared, practiced in markets, marriages, and municipal life as much as in mosques. Listen to the opening chapter, recited in every unit of prayer. Praise of God's mastery, a plea for guidance on the straight path. 5 times a day, millions renew a micro-constitution, aligning personal conduct with a universal order. When jurists later reason from the text on contracts, inheritance, dress, diet, they are not pulling rules from thin air. They are extending a logic that begins with divine address and ends in lived routines. In such a world, law is not a fence around belief. It is belief made legible. A community claims to hear the same voice and therefore to share the same obligations. You can see the ripple in everyday scenes. A shopkeeper pausing at sunset, a judge citing a verse in court, a school schedule bending to prayer. The sound moves outward through voices, then rules, then institutions, until the moral shape of society feels less like a private preference and more like a command heard together. Before minarets rose over the Iranian plateaus, fire temples dotted the horizon. Flames tended through the night as shepherds watched the sky for omens. In this landscape, Zarathustra recast the world as a moral battlefield, not a quarrel of jealous gods. At the center stands a single wise creator, source of mind and right order, opposed not by an equal rival, but the lie, a parasitic untruth that warps creation. The struggle isn't spectacle, it's daily, fought in word, deed, and intention. Truth and order aren't abstractions, they're the grain of reality. Move with the grain and the world runs clear. Push against it and splinters fly. Even death carries the same logic. The soul steps onto a narrow crossing, pictured as a bridge, where a life has weight. For the truthful, it widens into open air and fragrance. For the deceitful, it narrows towards smoke and cold. Judgment isn't a clerk's verdict. It's the consequence of alignment with the way things are. That alignment is chosen. Humans aren't puppets on divine strings. They are, strikingly for the ancient world, moral agents whose decisions tilt the cosmos. Speak truth, keep faith, tend fire, feed the poor. These do not merely polish the self, they mend a damaged creation. Angels and adversaries become less like characters and more like currents, forces aiding or resisting the work of setting things right. Listen closely, and a familiar map emerges. One high God, a final reckoning, bliss and punishment with texture, not haze, a cosmic ethic made visible in daily practice. Iranian kings later grounded legitimacy in stewardship of that order. When justice failed, the atmosphere around the throne seemed to change before soldiers ever did. Across centuries, the vocabulary shifts, scriptures change, institutions rise and fall. The template remains. Authority is moral before it is legal. And a community proves its faith not by private feeling, but by building a world where truth can stand without wobbling. You can still hear the echo today, whenever public life is judged not just by outcomes, but whether it feels aligned with a deeper rightness. As I read through sources for this chapter, I kept a cup of tea in our ancient secrets mug, the sort of companion any scribe or jurist would have recognized at their desk. You'll find it in the pinned comment.
On Iranian reliefs, kings don't just wear crowns, they stand inside legitimacy. Not mere pageantry, a test. The right to rule is imagined as something you can feel in the air around a worthy monarch, steady when justice holds, unstable when it doesn't. Keep order and the atmosphere clears. Fail and pressure drops long before soldiers do. You can hear the logic in cliffside inscriptions. A king claims favor from the wise lord, brands rebels liars, and narrates victory as truth prevailing over deceit. The message isn't simply, "I won." It's, "The cosmos agreed." That framing lets ordinary misrule, corruption, cruelty, neglect of ritual, read as a cosmic malfunction. Grain prices spike, rivers misbehave, borders fray, not random weather, but the barometer falling. Literature makes it visceral. In the old epics, a good king's presence settles the land. Music returns to the court, harvests hold, warriors obey without being asked. When a ruler turns arrogant or unjust, the change feels meteorological. Advisors grow careful, nightmares coil around the throne, and the charge around the palace slackens. Power lingers for a beat, like thunder after lightning, and then the break. A usurper rises, a loyal general hesitates, a city gate swings at night. What matters is the measure. Authority isn't validated by duration or lineage alone. It is weighed, always, against a ruler's guardianship of truth and equity. The state becomes a moral instrument, and the king its conductor, expected to tune courts and taxes, shrines and roads to the same pitch. In that expectation lies a habit that outlives dynasties. Political failure is, at root, moral failure. Across centuries, the vocabulary shifts, but the test persists. When governance is imagined as stewardship of a deeper order, remedies aren't slogans or spectacles. They are repairs, visible from the fields, restoring balance so that crops, courts, and frontiers all point the same direction again. When Arab armies crossed onto the Iranian plateau in the 7th century, the map changed faster than the habits beneath it. New banners, new governors, a new confession, but markets still opened at dawn, canals needed clearing, tax registers had to balance. Islam did not sweep Iran clean, it rekeyed the scale. Law and religion no longer sat in neighboring rooms. They shared a desk, stamped the same orders, and spoke with one voice. The Quran's legal and ethical claims, contracts, inheritance, testimony, ritual, moved into courtrooms as Sharia, a system meant to translate revelation into daily practice. Judges heard disputes with scripture and prophetic precedent at hand. Preachers folded moral instruction into the Friday sermon that named the ruler. Market inspectors walked the bazaar to guard honest weights and modest conduct. Wrongdoing wasn't only a sin, it became legible to officials and corrected in public view. And yet the country remained unmistakably Iranian. Administration ran on structures inherited from the Sassanians. The Diwan, the state ledger, kept its Persian logic, even as Arabic became the language of power. Families steeped in Iranian statecraft staffed chancelleries from Kufa to Baghdad. Poets honed a new literary Persian in Arabic script. You can see the braid even on coins. For years after the conquest, mints struck pieces that kept Sasanian fire altars or royal busts, ringed with Arabic professions of faith. Old images, new words, the same economy, re-sanctified. This blend made the moral turn plausible. If the courts that ruled on contracts also ruled on decency, and if the sermon that blessed the ruler also sketched right behavior, then a society's virtue could be managed with the same instruments as its taxes. The closeness of law and belief let the state claim to be more than a referee. It could present itself as guardian of the straight path. Iran, no stranger to sacred kingship, adapted quickly to sacred jurisprudence. Its bureaucracy humming as before, its horizons now oriented toward Mecca, and its public life increasingly calibrated to a rulebook that spoke in the accents of revelation.
Out of Scripture comes a simple pairing: promote what is right, restrain what is wrong, and it refuses to stay on the page. Preachers recite it as a virtue. Jurists write it into duties. Administrators build desks around it. In the classical city, one official could embody the idea, the muhtasib, part ethicist, part regulator, walking the bazaar with a small team and a ledger. He checked weights and measures, broke up fraud, cooled tempers, cautioned against indecency, reminded shopkeepers of prayer time. A scale pan sits too light, a bribe moves hand to hand, a stall blocks the street. None of these are only nuisances. Each is a crack in the moral pavement to be repaired in public view. Think health inspector, consumer watchdog, and neighborhood mediator rolled into one. Put simply, belief, behavior, and bureaucracy are welded into one system. The logic is expansive. If virtue is a shared obligation, silence becomes a kind of complicity. The famous ladder of response, change a wrong by the hand, or the tongue, or at least the heart, slides easily into a civic program. Some will legislate, some will counsel, some will watch and report. Mosque pulpits teach, courtrooms codify, market squads enforce. The line between advice and authority thins until many people are, in small ways, extensions of the same duty. Iran's own habit of moralized governance makes the fit snug. A society long taught that order has a sacred grain can accept inspectors who treat fairness, modesty, and honest dealing as public infrastructure. Over centuries, the duty changes costume. Sufi council in a lodge, a jurist's chapter in a law manual, a town officer's morning rounds. But the spine holds. Right conduct is not merely an inner state, it has to be built into streets and schedules. In the modern republic, this duty receives institutional names and budgets, finding its way into committees, bylaws, and constitutional language.
What looks like policing to an outsider is, to its designers, maintenance of a covenant. Citizens and state bound to cultivate conditions where righteousness is normal and vice struggles to take root. Treat goodness as a public utility, and enforcement begins to read less like intrusion and more like repair. If you lived under a system where legitimacy was measured in moral atmosphere, what sign would you trust first? Public order, just courts, or the tone of everyday life?
After the prophet's death, the questions seemed practical. Who leads now? And then turned existential. Some argued the community should choose the most capable. Others held that guidance must remain in the prophet's family through Ali and his descendants. From that fork, two roads took shape. Sunnis privileged consensus and precedent. Shia looked to the imams, heirs, not just by blood, but by a charge to guard truth in its finest grain. Leadership then wasn't only administration, it was illumination. For Shia, the imam is a living compass, scholar, judge, exemplar, whose authority flows from divine designation. But history is untidy. Imams were marginalized, surveilled, sometimes killed. Then the absence sharpened. The 12th imam withdrew from public life, remembered as the occultation. The community had to navigate without its guide in sight. Here, jurists stepped forward. If the imam is hidden, someone must tend his responsibilities. Alms and endowments, courts and contracts, the teaching that stitches ordinary life to sacred intent. Over generations, a learned class, the ulama, built a bridge of rulings and institutions. People sought those with the deepest mastery as sources to emulate, maraja al-taqlid, and a distributed network of authority formed, parish by parish, seminary by seminary. In practice, families chose a trusted scholar the way many today choose a doctor or accountant for complex decisions. Alongside this, another current ran strong in Iran. Sufi paths that trained the inner ear, chants in lodges, ethics taught by example, a taste for presence over polemic. Personal devotion didn't cancel juristic order, it made the stakes intimate. Right conduct wasn't only compliance, it was the polish of the heart. Put together, the result is distinctive. Sunnis tended to seat authority in institutions of state and scholarly consensus. Shia developed a clerical authority that could function even in opposition, sustaining law, finance, and education from the below. When a chance came to scale up, there was already a chassis. Seminaries that could act as ministries, legal opinions that could act as policy, trusted scholars whose phones rang before a minister's did. The habit of moral guidance had quietly become an infrastructure.
Early 1500s, cavalry banners snapping over Tabriz, red felt caps of the Kizilbash bright as coals, and a teenage warlord, Ismail, claiming both throne and sanctity. Overnight, the rules of belonging change. 12-verse Shiism, a minority on the plateau, becomes law by royal decree. The Friday sermon acquires new names and new curses. Public rituals are rewritten, and mosques retune their pulpits to an unfamiliar cadence. Dissent doesn't just risk prison. It reads as treason against the order of the world. The state needs specialists to make this stick. Caravans bring jurists from Jabal Amil in Iraq, men like Al-Karaki, who carry libraries in their heads. They reorganize courts, standardize endowments, and train a new generation to anchor identity. Lay people are told to follow qualified authorities in practice, taqlid, not as blind obedience, but as the practical way complex law becomes livable. Across dialects and tribes, a unifying rhythm forms. People scattered over mountains and cities, aligning daily routines to the rulings of a handful of recognized masters. Ismail's early charisma makes conversion feel like destiny. But charisma burns hot and brief. Institutions must cool the metal. Under Thahmasp and Abbas, the clerical estate receives endowments, schools, and jurisdiction. A scholar's ink begins to move money and men. Markets and marriage contracts, inheritance and ritual pass through the same filter, staffed by jurists who speak for the hidden Imam's law in the here and now. Look closely at coins and inscriptions, and the identity hardens. Titles that once praised kings alone twine with the names of the Imams. Architectural programs set doctrine into brick. A polity is being engineered, not merely governed. By the time Isfahan blooms in blue, the experiment holds. A Shi'i state whose moral grammar runs through seminaries as surely as it runs through palaces. Conformity is enforced less by spectacle than by paperwork. Registers, waqf ledgers, court seals, so that orthodoxy arrives not only with soldiers, but with the forms you sign, the sermons you hear, and the calendar that tells you when to gather. The Pahlavi project began with scissors, uniforms for judges, Western hats for men, a decree that veils would vanish from the street. In 1936, police escorted unveiled wives and daughters into ceremonies to model the new order. Teachers tugged scarves loose at school gates. Courts were centralized, seminaries sidelined, the calendar sanded of religious rhythms. Modernity arrived as mandate. Under the sun, the tempo quickened. Oil money lifted highways, dams, factories, and a glittering capital. The White Revolution broke estates into peasant plots, launched literacy corps, granted women the vote. Ministries imported French-style legal codes. State firms crowded traditional guilds. Savak watched the public square, filing the edges off dissenting pulpits. Progress spoke in concrete and light. The old arbitrators of morality were told to keep to the mosque. A counter-diagnosis spread in bookshops. Garb Zadegi, westoxication, a borrowed gloss over a fading core. Jalal al-Ahmed wrote it like a clinical note. Technology without a rooted ethic turns a nation into a showroom. The point wasn't nostalgia. It claimed that prosperity, detached from shared virtue, hollows agency and breeds dependence. Ritual made the critique visible. On Shi'i holy days, mourning caravans moved down new boulevards under old banners. Sermons stitched economic grievance to sacred story. Freshly poured avenues became processional routes, and the past turned into a measuring stick held up to glass towers. From exile, Khomeini tuned to that frequency. Cassettes of his talks slipped through bazaars and bus stations. A 40-day cadence of funerals and marches taught crowds to return on schedule. The monarchy's wager that development could stand in for legitimacy began to wobble as prices spiked, oil wheezed, and the police felt everywhere. By the late 1970s, the question had shifted, not how to modernize, but who guards the nation's soul. What looked like scattered piety revealed itself as infrastructure. Seminaries, endowments, charitable networks, a rank of preachers and merchants. When the throne fell, a ready-made chassis stood in the street. The The state that followed promised to cure the diagnosed illness by binding progress to public virtue, recasting moral guidance as the skeleton of national renewal.
Exile sharpened the idea. In Najaf, Khomeini taught small classes and returned to an old Shi'i problem. If the Imam is hidden, who carries the public duties that keep a community upright, judging disputes, guarding endowments, protecting the vulnerable? His answer was spare and audacious. Jurists already guided consciences. They should guide the state. The theory took a name: velayat-e Faqih, guardianship of the jurist, and a new center of gravity. Clerical authority would no longer orbit politics. When the Shah fell in 1979, the blueprint landed. The Constitution placed a supreme leader above elected offices, with clerical bodies to keep the line straight, a guardian council to vet laws and candidates, an assembly of experts to select and supervise the leader, revolutionary courts to reset the legal field. Parallel forces formed beside the army: the Revolutionary Guard and, beneath it, the Basij, tasked with defending the revolution's moral perimeter as much as its borders. Parliament could debate. Jurists defined the rails. The promise was order with a soul. Universities were cleansed, media retuned, school books rewritten so religious instruction and civic duty marched together. Market inspectors gained new mandates. Neighborhood committees braided charity, surveillance, and piety. Elections continued, but every candidacy passed through gates shaped by doctrine. The claim stayed consistent. Sovereignty belongs to God. Popular will is honored within revealed bounds. Over time, the scaffolding thickened. An expediency council appeared to reconcile law with necessity. A 1989 amendment widened the leader's reach. As charisma faded, institutions held. Seminaries as policy labs, security organs as moral patrols, jurisprudence written in the prose of budgets and bylaws. Look closely and the through line clears. A society long trained to see right order as public architecture now had a state built to constructed by decree. Footnotes turned into regulations, sermons into spending lines. In a republic of ballots and billboards, legitimacy rested finally on an office that claimed to hear the straight path, more distinctly than the crowd, and to translate that certainty into the schedules, curricula, and committees that shape everyday life. Stand back from the timeline. In the pattern sharpens. The Islamic Republic arranges power like a funnel. A supreme leader above elected offices, a guardian council sifting laws and candidates, courts and committees tasked with keeping conduct inside sacred rails. Popular will moves, but only within a moral architecture the state claims to hear more clearly than the crowd. What looks like a modern invention is an old habit wearing new names. Iran has long treated public order as a sacred craft. First with kings whose right to rule held only as long as justice did, then with jurists who insisted that right conduct be legible in streets and schools. When belief, law, and rule braid for centuries, moral enforcement doesn't arrive as novelty. It arrives as maintenance. And the promised reveal? Trace today's blueprint and you can feel the pressure of an earlier stencil. Long before the Qur'an was recited in Iranian courts, a local grammar sketched truth against the lie. Ordeals and judgment, guiding beings and a crossing between worlds. A ruler's standing waxed and waned with his stewardship of order. The vocabulary has changed. The map is familiar. That's why the modern crown is invisible and the oath is juristic. The old logic travels from diadem to decree without losing its charge.
Names shift: Shah, Ayatollah, Palace, Seminary, but the job description endures. Keep the straight path straight and prove it in public. If this reframed how you see Iran's moral state, tell me where the pattern clicked. Safavid courts, market inspectors, or that invisible crown light carried into the present? What parallel do you see between ancient legitimacy and modern law? Drop your take below.
Share, comment, and subscribe to Armchair Archaeology for more Past with a Pulse. Tap the bell so you don't miss the next dig. Ready for your next stop? Jump to The Real Babylon Was Nothing Like the Myth for the deep roots, or the Middle East playlist for the full arc, both on screen and linked below. Until next time, keep questioning, stay curious, and remember, tomorrow has always been ancient. Their fires lit the night, their laws cut the stone, and their fingerprints are still on our future.